This lesson is for quadratic equations and using the quadratic formula to solve quadratic equations. So a quadratic equation is always going to be written in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. And a, b, and c represent numbers, and a cannot equal 0. So if you're given an equation, a quadratic equation, the first step before using your quadratic formula is to identify what the values for a, b, and c are. So in this equation, my a is the number multiplied by x squared. So my a is going to be 2. My b is the number multiplied by x. So the b in this problem is 6. And c is that constant term. So c in this one is going to be 8. Once you've identified those numbers, now you can use your quadratic formula. So make sure you've got this written down in your notes. The quadratic formula, we have x equals a minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all divided by 2a. And the quadratic formula is really helpful for when you're trying to solve a trinomial by factoring it and the factors are difficult to find. The quadratic formula will work for all trinomials. So to put this into an example, for x squared, we want to identify a, the number in front of x squared. Since there's not a number there, think of it as being a 1. So a equals 1. B is the number multiplied by x, so b is 9. And c in this case is a minus 22. Okay, so your first step, identify a, b, and c. The next step is to continue by using your quadratic formula. So make sure you've got a lot of paper for this because it takes up a decent amount of paper. So we want to plug in our numbers. So we would have x equals, and then it's a minus b. Our b is 9, so we'd have a minus 9 plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b again is 9, so 9 squared minus 4 times a, so a was 1, times a minus 22, all divided by 2 times 1. Now simplifying for your next step, x equals a minus 9 plus or minus the square root of 81, and then multiplying a minus 4 times 1, that would be a minus 4. Minus 4 times a minus 22, so 22 times 4, we come up with 88. So since it's a negative times a negative, you'd have a positive 88, all divided by 2. And then x equals a minus 9 plus or minus the square root of 169, all divided by 2. So once you get to this step, you can then factor out what that square root is. So x equals a minus 9 plus or minus 13, all divided by 2. So the square root of 169 is 13. Now this is where you've got your two separate equations because you're trying to figure out what the two values for x are. So one would be x equals a minus 9 plus 13 divided by 2. And the other one is x equals a minus 9 minus 13 divided by 2 because you got this plus or minus. So then simplifying, you would have a negative 9 plus 13, that would be a positive 4 over 2. Reducing that, one value for x is x equals 2. In our other example, adding the opposite, negative 9 plus a negative 13. X equals a negative 24 over 2. Negative 24 divided by 2, you'd have x equals a negative 12. So there would be the two possible answers for x given this trinomial. Now, trying it with one more example. Again, make sure you've got your quadratic formula. So remember that this number represents A, this number represents B, and this number represents C. So plugging into our equation, we have x equals a minus b, so a minus 3, plus or minus the square root of b squared. So b is 3, so 3 squared minus 4 times a. A is, there's not a number there, so think of it as a 1. So 4 times 1 times a minus 6 all over 2 times a, and a was 1. So next part is just simplifying. So we have x equals a negative 3 plus or minus 9, or the square root of 9, and then a negative 4 times 1 is negative 4. Negative 4 times a negative 6 would be a positive 24, all divided by 2. And then x equals a negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 33, all divided by 2. And this one, since 33 is not a perfect square, we will have a decimal. So x equals negative 3 plus or minus, and when you take the square root of 33, you end up with about 5.74. So plus or minus 5.74 all divided by 2. And so this is really where the quadratic formula is helpful when you've got trinomials that can't be factored very well, because we're getting decimals. Our x values are going to equal decimals, and it's really difficult to factor if they're not whole numbers or integer values. So now, since it's plus or minus 5.74, we want to set up our two equations. So x could equal 3 plus 5.74 all divided by 2. So x equals 8.74 divided by 2, and then x would equal about 4.37. So there's one value for x, and I'm going to put the squiggly equal sign to show that it's approximately 4.37. So there's one value. Our other option would be x equals 3 minus 5.74 all divided by 2. And then 3 minus 5.74, we've got x equals a negative 2.74 divided by 2. And then x would equal approximately a negative 1.37. So there's our two answers for this trinomial using the quadratic formula.